Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Tales of Tactics. This is our show that gives tabletop games the book club treatment. Grab a glass of whatever and join us as we dive deep into the bizarre origins, the surprising mechanics, and the tiny fine print of games that you know or may never have heard of. This is your host, Troy, and joining me is my co-host, Max, and working with us behind the scenes, as always, is our producer, Jay. Today's episode is going to be a dual episode about space weirdos and its companion, sword weirdos.
Yeah, so before we get into that, we just wanted to address some housekeeping stuff around how we do this show and give you an update to the new direction for those of you that are listening. One thing that we want to do is we want to bring in our upcoming episodes newer games and try to be a little bit more... We're not going to aim to be a news channel. I think there's a lot of other podcasts and YouTube channels that do that probably better than we would. But we want to give our view on things that are relevant to current gaming, as well as also doing those old gems and the things that are more obscure. In addition to that, we want to do our topical discussions around something that different games intersect on. So this could be like time and distance, or the way that turns are handled, or character attributes, and then kind of find between games along those topics. And those would be a bit more of a open-ended discussion, but we would have a structure for that. The overall goal that we're shooting for is to try and bring this up to a once-a-week show. We can't guarantee that we're going to be able to do that with all of our scheduling, but we're going to be trying to make more episodes and a wider variety of those.
Exactly.
With that said, let's move on to today's episode.
So we're looking at an indie, or a pair of indie skirmish games that capture the flair of old school miniature gaming while having the accessibility and flow of a modern game. We are looking at Casey Garske's design. They're an independent game designer known for creating compact, accessible skirmish games. And the design philosophy behind Space and Sword Weirdos is a focus on blending elements from various games into a simple yet engaging experience. It emphasizes the importance of weirdness, as indicated in the title, and chaotic outcomes are just par for the course in his games. A lot of that comes from the dice tables and rolls we'll be talking about as we go forward. And another big element of the success of his games, and what the designer credits, is community involvement and collaboration with different artists and content creators in the space.
So we've played Space Weirdos, and we found it a pretty enjoyable experience. That's why we wanted to talk about it today. But this is a more recent game that was developed during the COVID situation and developed more or less online in a sort of playtesting environment. It became a popular seller on Wargaming Vault.
And the gameplay focuses on fast-paced, tactical skirmish gameplay. And what really appeals to me is the use of both random tables and opposed roll-offs to ensure both dynamic and unpredictable outcomes.
Yeah, there's a very quick and ready feel to this game, and that's one of the most appealing things. So you don't have to get bogged down in learning a bunch of rules. The page count for any one of these, like the longest one, which would be Sword Weirdos, is only 24 pages long, and that includes the cover.
And that's designed to be accessible. Like, that's compact, that's very minimalist, and for the most part is minimalist tokens as well. There's one slightly strange token choice I'll comment on, but otherwise I really like how lightweight the games both play in respect to what you as a player needs to take on board to get it to table.
And then the sequel, if you can call it that, spiritual sequel or parallel game, is Sword Weirdos. So that came out sometime later and is definitely built on the response to Space Weirdos. Was really brought in by, I don't know to call it was brought in by fan requests, but there's a note in the book saying that the response drove Casey to make the next installment in the game. And this one is, I want to say it's more modular in a lot of ways. And it simplifies some aspects, but it also broadens a lot of the rules in other ways. And it is more of a fantasy, I guess, medieval-esque, but I guess you could bring in other elements that are in that area.
It does have some strong gonzo fantasy as well.
Oh, yeah.
So there's some good out there stuff if you want to get more acid fantasy, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, it definitely has that. Well, again, it's still weirdo in the title.
Exactly. Can't forget.
So in ostensively, it is the same game, which is why we're reviewing them together. There are some things that I like more about one game than the other, but they both operate on the same core concept, which I thought was really, really good and accessible. And I look forward to doing it at club gatherings and doing it as an open public game.
That would be perfect for this. Is something where you had just a collection of 6 to 12 models on each side, basic stats presented on a single sheet of paper. People can walk up to your table at the event and just start playing.
Yep. Like it's very throwdown-esque.
Yeah.
I'd say it's a little bit heavier than what you might call a beer and pretzels game, but not that much more. I don't think it takes that much explanation. And there's a lot of areas where the rules are consistent but simple enough that you can rule them being one way or the other.
I would agree with that.
Just to give the sort of final point, you can go to Casey Garske's website, Garske Games, garske.games. That should get you there. There isn't much there except that there are links to Drive-Thru, Wargame Vault, and there's a really handy space weirdo warband builder, which actually works. I played around with it. It's pretty good.
And these two games come to you in the same format of a self-published PDF following the template and stylings of a zine.
Yeah.
So there's definitely an influence from the RPG world in terms of how this booklet is presented and styled, in that it doesn't have the, I'll favorably call it, robust pragmatism of a Wargames Vault release, if you know what I'm saying. Like, this actually has art and style to it. You know, it's not just like double column with a couple pictures of some of the author's miniatures. You know what I'm saying?
It does have that.
It does have that. But it also does have, it still manages to have that. You're absolutely correct. But it does have a little bit more style and flair to it, which I personally think is cool to see in the wargaming verse, where that is usually left behind to bigger publications.
So yeah, having that zine format makes it very, very accessible. And if you know how to set your pages properly so that they can be printed off, you can print one of these booklets yourself from a home printer and self-staple your set.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, even the quick reference in the back is probably enough if you just printed that.
Oh, yeah.
And then you can consult a PDF on a tablet or e-reader if you need, or a phone. But I don't know. I like the style and the art that is presented for these games. It's got a really cool simplicity to it, but it's got an edge. So I do quite like that. And when it comes to the layout and the design, I like Sword Weirdos better than Space Weirdos, if I have to say.
Yeah, it's cleaner for sure. Honestly, they're both of a level where I didn't find it too difficult. There was one rule, which we'll probably get to in Space Weirdos, where I didn't immediately see that when we were playing, and then later on we figured that out. Let's get into the core of the system. So one of the more interesting aspects, we haven't talked about Dungeon Crawl Classics, but this Sword Weirdos games uses, and Space Weirdos for that matter, uses a dice chain system. So the way that works is you have your different die types, in this case, D4, D6, D8, D10, D12, and some bonuses are given based on shifting the type of die up and down one. And the nice thing about this particular dice chain is it typically uses 2 dice, so you get that sort of median average between every die.
Yep.
So that's one thing that's kind of a neat value, but that median average increases depending on the die type. And the other thing, which beats one criticism that I have about DCC, is there's an even increment between each one, which is 2 extra sides per polyhedral that you're rolling. So it's very consistent and it's very simple. You just have this handful of die types, and you can get that by buying basically 2 D&D sets.
Yep.
And then screening out the unrelated.
And what's interesting is your resolution types, as Max was saying, is basically just 2 of the same die rolled, and attack resolution is pretty much identical in both of these 2 games.
The other element that it uses, I don't feel one way or the other about this. maybe Troy, you can tell me. I think maybe the measurement is a little bit peculiar to me, but it uses a 5-inch stick to measure, which is marked halfway in the middle.
That's right.
And it uses a standardized form. And he typically says that you should have 3 of these because some characters can potentially do 3 moves. So you can like line the sticks. You can't bend movement. So characters always move in a straight line from stick to stick. But you can use multiple sticks if your character has multiple moves to then orientate around a battlefield. But those sticks can also be used as a radial determination for, say, a radius effect weapon, like a grenade.
Or the cone of a flamethrower, right?
Exactly. You can take 3 of them together to make a triangle.
Yes.
I like the ingenuity and resourcefulness of just using a few components in many different ways. I think that is an excellent philosophy to have when you're designing a game like this.
Now, I'm not perturbed at all by the stick. There are other games I've played that similarly use measurement sticks with no bending or turning of movement. So that's not too outlandish to me. I like the ability to sort of take away the measuring tape as well, because I've never felt this, but many seem to have an apprehension in using a measuring device in a game, feeling like that's some additional layer of complexity. So this manages to, I'll say, round down the complexity by using a shape tool, and you've seen that in big budget games like Kill Team.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen that in, smaller indie games like Ganesha Games, Tale of Advanced Blade and Heroes. But that would be examples of where I've seen this and felt comfortable with it. What I don't necessarily love is, depending on how many sticks of movement you take, you place a token next to your character or fighter to indicate that distance. So if you took 3 sticks of movement, you would place a token indicating 3 footprints as they show you in the book. And that's a little fiddly, a little token heavy for me right in the movement phase, but it does work in that your movement will influence attacks coming in and out of your character, so to speak.
If having that value has some relevant effect on the game, then it's worth marking. But I agree. I'm usually against the idea of an excessive amount of tokens. Even for marking regular values on units in war games, I much prefer to use small dice.
That's what I would use for this, for sure, is I would use a die and just tick it up to, say, 2 if you took a double movement. Just put a little, 16 millimeter die next to your character that shows a 2. The comparison I would make to this would be BattleTech Alpha Strike, where it's like your target movement modifier, your TMM.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of is the same thing, but in a skirmish game, which feels a little bit weird at first. But when we get into attacking and combat, which we'll move to now, there will be times where you're actually modified by your distance moved, how difficult you are to strike, for example.
Yeah.
So that's important. Actually, before we go to combat, I do want to mention Sword Weirdos, like it does in many cases, introduces a little bit more of a complex wrinkle to the game with additional movement rules for jumping and climbing.
And that just uses the stick in a slightly different way. So it basically has the idea of traversing an object or vertical movement, if that's relevant to the terrain. My only feeling about the stick as a final point to this is it's not about the stick itself. I actually am totally fine with set measurements and having played the game and, taking straws and just cutting them to length. Totally fine with that. I find the peculiar part being the 5 inches, because there are half distances for some things. Again, this is not a relevant thing. A distance is a distance and you forget about it really quickly. But something that doesn't divide evenly, so it goes down to 2.5, is a little weird.
Yeah, 2.5 inches. Like, why isn't the stick 6 inches?
And I'm just not used to it. That's basically the extent of my feelings on that. I'm just like, oh, 1/2 inch? Okay. But then because it's a set movement, I forget measuring in a number at all. And I'm like, oh, it's this or half of this.
Yes.
So I won't die on that criticism. I'm like, playing the game, I forget about it.
And next, perhaps most importantly for a miniature skirmish game, is how combat works. So Space Weirdos has combat as separated into 2 statistical values, firepower and prowess. This is different in Sword Weirdos, which combines them into might. So Space Weirdos will give you a distinction between a shooter and a stabber in an interesting capacity, while Sword Weirdos, because of the emphasis on melee combat, will just combine it to might, and there's more details in the individual weapon types to then make range feel distinct from just a punch that extends out to 18 inches, for example.
That's sort of the give and take, but it makes sense because Sword Weirdos is much more of a melee focus game, as you were saying. And there are range weapons, but I want to say that Sword Weirdos is more equipment based than, say, Space Weirdos, which is more unit based.
I would agree with that. Because something you pointed out offline when we were chatting was the equipment in Space Weirdos tends to be more augmentative as opposed to a different item altogether in itself that you interact with.
The game is very what you see is what you get in how you determine things. And the best way that I've found when playing Space Weirdos is you just grab the mini and then look at that guy and be like, okay, of these stats, what would I count as what? And that would determine the point value.
Mm-hmm.
One criticism that I have about loadouts, which we could probably get into when we get to scenarios, but I may as well just mention it here, is that it's sometimes very hard to balance odd point values because there are only a few things in Space Weirdos that are 1 point.
Yes.
So that you can, like, it would be nice to see some of the things that they have in Sword Weirdos, but again, hindsight is 2020. But there are items that are like one-use items, like potions and stuff. I forgot what I think they call them something else. It's nice to have those little quick things in your list where it's like, oh, we're 1 point away from each other from having a balanced game, even though they have set values in the rules. I don't always follow those. So having something where I can be like, oh, I'll just take one or two of these and then we'll be in an even shot for each other. Because 1 point makes a pretty big difference in the game.
Well, considering your point values in Space Weirdos are either 75 points or 125 points for a 2x2 table or a 3x3 table, comparing that to in Sword Weirdos, you have 75 for a 2x2, 100 for whatever table size you want, and then 125 for a 3x3 big fight. So there's a very small range, that the point values account for. And there's not a lot of dialing in the point values because things either cost, the most something can cost in Space Weirdos is either 25 points for a character or 20 points for a basic fighter. So there's not a lot to fill in small gaps in points, if you know what I'm saying. You might end up with 13 points loose and not really have anything you can do with it.
I think that that's more recognized in Sword Weirdos, that there are more finer options that you can choose to sort of slot in and customize characters. And some of it can be things that we can say exist in some space, but aren't necessarily represented on the model.
Yeah, backpack items, etc.
Yeah, disposable items. Spells can be useful in this case, and there's a wider range of spells or spell-like abilities, if you want to get to that. So it's probably worth talking about how the attack works, because this is where some of the weirdness comes in. So there are roles for attacking targets, and in some cases, especially in close combat, it's kind of an opposed roll based on the defense, or it can just be trying to beat the defense when attacking the opponent. Now, what's interesting is the result of the attack is rolled onto a table, and so you have these different conditions that a character can have that layer onto each other. So the two main ones are down and staggered. You can have those independently. Down basically means that your character is turned onto its side and now requires one move action to stand back up, so it basically kills a move. Staggered is similar, but I believe it only applies a modifier. Am I correct in that?
Well, staggered is at first a modifier, and then a second staggered result will take you out of action.
Right, yes. So the staggered is more of the wounded condition.
That's right.
And it's possible to roll on a single attack, both staggered and down, which is pretty bad. And then out of action is the most affecting result. But the interesting point about on this 2d6 roll is that there are values going toward the low end that are a lot more, how shall I say, unexpected or surprising. So one of them is to knock back an opponent or force them into cover. I'm reading the Sword Weirdos one at the moment, but the Space Weirdos one is quite similar. You can force an opponent to break away from you. So basically cause a short retreat, which is similar to knockback. But in the case of the knockback, they also fall, so they become down. Then there's going on a worse roll. There's defensive strikes. So if any able defending model may immediately take a melee attack action instead against the attacker. So kind of like leaving yourself open allows for a strike. And then the worst result is counter strike / return fire, where basically, and this is always the fun one when you're shooting at somebody in Space Weirdos, and then they immediately shoot back at you as a reaction. It's one of those things you don't see in a lot of games that adds some flavor to the game. I guess it's sort of the equivalent of a critical miss in say, a role-playing game, or even some war games that have that.
What I really like about it is, instead of there being complex conditions and modifiers that apply to, say, Overwatch or taking a return shot, it's just an outcome on this random table. So the complexity is almost implied to be there as opposed to actually be there in terms of like grokkable like levers for you as the player to grab and mess with, you know, like it was a more complex skirmish game.
Mm-hmm.
In this, it's just you might get that result and then your character shoots back. And that's part of the weirdness that I really enjoy about it.
So now we can get into special abilities. So these are the more distinctive elements. In the case of Space Weirdos, they are described as psychic powers. From what I described earlier about how the equipment feels like it's very much part of the character, or that it's more character-based, that it's kind of this build, and then you use that unit, the psychic powers work pretty well the same. It's basically something that can be done. It takes 2 moves to do, and it has a pretty dramatic effect. And there's some pretty interesting ones, like being able to move one of your opponent's units, or being able to flat out teleport, I believe is one of them.
Yep. Or resurrect one of your own through Meat Puppet.
Now, one of the things that I skipped, which is a very important thing to remember when using psychic powers particularly, is that if there's an unopposed roll, it's always against 2d6. And you can have your opponent roll that. But
I personally love that.
We couldn't find that rule the first time we played. And we're like, wait, if I'm just teleporting, we house ruled it as something kind of interesting, which was rolling against the willpower of the closest unit to the effect.
Right.
Which was a neat idea, though, again, probably this is a simpler way to do it. And this is just because we failed to read that part. But I was amused by the implication of that, because it was the idea that, like, the nearest person witnessing the teleportation or the nearest person to it, their willpower would push you and make you fail.
Yeah.
So it's like just the strength of their mind keeps you from opening space-time and traveling to a different location.
What I like about the 2d6 roll is it really suits a solo play, which there are solo rules in a 4-page supplement available for Space Weirdos.
Mm-hmm.
But what is interesting about the 2d6 roll is it effectively sets a DC or difficulty check that you then beat with your roll using your statistical values. So say you have a willpower of 2d10. You would roll your 2d10, and then you'd roll the opposing 2d6 to then see, did I pass the check? And if you're able to exceed it, the check is successful, and you cast your psychic power.
Yeah.
If you hit it or fail the target number by within half of the total, I'll explain this in a little bit more detail, you miss. The psychic power misfires, does not go off.
Mm-hmm.
But if you roll under half the total of the DC, so say you had to beat a DC of 16 on your roll, it would be 8. And if you rolled 8 or less, you take the hit of your psychic power.
Which, again, adds to that sort of chaotic nature.
So yeah, you could effectively punch yourself in the face if you're not careful with your psychic or your magic powers, which adds a lot of risk to that. But as we just were saying, they're pretty powerful abilities. So there's a risk-reward tension that you're playing with when you want to use those.
So each player has what is described as a warband, which is a common term, probably most notable in something like Mordheim, but definitely in other games. And there's an interesting difference between how Space Weirdos does it and how Sword Weirdos does it, where Space Weirdos, at least the examples suggest more of a complementary or homogeneous unit of soldiers. But there's certainly nothing restricting you from playing a bunch of wild street punks. But a lot of the examples given have them built in these sort of warband lists where they're almost like factions. It's just suggestive play. I will say having the examples there was a huge help.
I agree.
If your skirmish game or your war game doesn't have an example unit, but also has very customizable builds, you're doing yourself a disservice because it's very hard to kind of baseline. It was easy enough for me to pick up one of my minis and say, okay, that looks kind of like this thing that's described. And he's got really good, how would I say, generic descriptions of things that are kind of hinting at things that already exist. In a different vein, though, Sword Weirdos has a bit more of the ragtag outlaws. It's taking more from something like Mordheim, where you have these characters that are together, and the rules break down a much more customizable and flexible build. So you're going to end up, you can create more, I don't want to say fleshed out characters because they don't have enough things to give them a lot of distinction, but they have more personality based on their weapon types, based on their tactics, based on their skill abilities.
You could say that Space Weirdos is almost like you're building more of a squad or a related force, where in Sword Weirdos, it's almost like a D&D party where everyone is like completely different from each other in some respect.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not strictly speaking the case, but the way that they're presented in the two books feels a bit more like that. Like if I were to make a warband for Space Weirdos and I was playing it, say, like a convention or an open event, I might have the entire team written up on a sheet and like, that's your team. But if I were doing it with Sword Weirdos, and as I said, you could do this any way that you want, but the way that it's suggested is that I might do each character up like a card, and then you pick and choose guys and then try to balance your equation.
Yeah, like on an index card, old school style.
And because it has more of those balancing item type abilities, it's a lot easier to do that.
Yeah.
So you don't have to like say, oh, this is exactly a 30-point team versus another 30-point team. You can actually be like, oh, I'll take this guy, he's 7, and this guy's like 5, and I'll get enough of those together, and then we'll play a game. So I guess that'll get us into the equipment, which we've already touched on a little bit, so we'll be brief about that, but maybe, Troy, you can give your point of view on that.
So Space Weirdos has a focus on futuristic weapons and gear. A lot of your kind of rogue tradery items are definitely included and accounted for in this game.
Mm-hmm.
They mostly, like we were saying before, modify or augment one of your characteristics that you're going to roll on. So you'd get, for example, a +1 to your 2d8 firepower roll. So something like that. They're very basic to understand in Space Weirdos, which I like. It's very simple. Sword Weirdos, however, is a little bit more diverse with a wider range of items.
Mm-hmm.
They're all very much your fantasy fare, your medieval trope items, but you will have shields, two-handed weapons, ranged weapons, I guess. And these will allow you to get a little bit more customization into your party. Whereas we were just saying, Space Weirdos, there's a little bit more of a homogenous feeling to your group of dudes.
I think the term that I think I was searching for was Space Weirdos feels a lot more baked in, both in terms of how their units are built and how warbands are built.
So how the game fundamentally works is you'll be playing 3 different scenarios. The scenarios break down into simple objectives, and because of the zine format, the author says they're only obligated to give you a couple scenarios to get started, but they're pretty comprehensive. And for the most part, if you want something more, you could start with what's in the box and just tweak from there.
They're, again, pretty simple. There's usually some kind of main holding objective. So you can have a King of the Hill, which is a pretty typical one, where whoever occupies the objective marker in a certain number of turns or is able to lock down secondary objectives. This is mainly in Space Weirdos. They have one where there's like a main point, but then you can also add in supply points or treasure effectively. In Space Weirdos, it seems a little more arbitrary what these objectives are, which is fine because you can say, oh, we're trying to protect this power station. But in Sword Weirdos, we have a lot of the same objectives. So we have the really basic kill 'em all, where players basically roll initiative and then attempt to take each player out until one team is eliminated. And then you have more nuanced objectives based around securing treasure. whatever that might be.
Yeah.
There's some fun twists where Sword Weirdos has things where like you can have a mimic treasure chest. And so it could be a false objective that then becomes a trap, essentially. And that's basically the extent of the types of games that you can play. But if you really break down a lot of those more complex games, unless it's a fully written scenario with a lot of steps, that is effectively the game. I think the only thing that this is missing that I think a lot of games that say Games Workshop does is that there's no morale system.
That's right. There's no morale system. So your fighters, actually, I will say there is the broken mechanic. So perhaps I will push back just a little bit.
Sure.
Just because you roll initiative at the start of the turn. And if you are broken, you're actually going to suffer a die shift down. You're going to go down a die type. And how you break is you end up at half or less models. So it's not really a developed morale system or something where you're testing morale reactions in individuals per se, but it is still there to sort of prevent the outcome that Laserburn talked about, where you have half-dead warbands dragging themselves towards each other to finish the fight.
Yeah.
It does lean into preventing that a little bit, but it doesn't really go full morale. And the other thing I will say is it doesn't have a campaign system.
I don't think that's a huge loss in the fact that the way this game is written, but it would be nice as an addition to have something like that.
I could see a fun way to spend XP to increase stats. I could see currency for buying warband members that become wounded or lost. There could be a little bit of that, but that's why I would say this game, like for example, Space Weirdos is maybe my second favorite way to use Necromunda models.
Right.
In that the primary way is more of an enriched campaign experience, but this, nothing can beat how fast it is and how quickly you can just flip open the section on Razor Girls, then look at your models, say, that's pretty good, that's pretty good. I'm going to rewrite the stats of this one and go from there.
Yeah. The speed and accessibility are pretty much the primary selling feature. And the speed in which you can teach somebody how to play the game is really, really effective. You and I played, and then I was very quickly able to show Jacob how it played, and then we were able to have a fun little skirmish within 10, 15 minutes. I really think that if someone is interested in something that they don't need a lot of complexity behind, Space Weirdos is probably more appealing in that regard. But if you want a little bit more crunch to it, then Sword Weirdos is a good second to that.
I would agree. I think Space Weirdos is the more streamlined of the two, but it works with perhaps the widest range of models, where Sword Weirdos offers a lot of individual depth on your characters because of the class and equipment selections you get to make.
So both games have a wide range of customization, if you hadn't picked up on that. Sword Weirdos has a lot more individuality, but effectively both games function about the same. The balance in these is, I would say, intuitive. I haven't really broken it down or played it enough to really say how balanced it is, but having those different character archetypes is really, really helpful in at least getting a sense of, oh, this is the Space Marine equivalent, and this is your Guardsman equivalent. The point values based on how you earn points for greater dies, or die values, die types, to use the proper term, it seems reflective. The one thing that maybe kind of pushes against the idea of there being a campaign mode to this is the numerical scaling. Now that I think about it, I think that might be one of the hardest things in a campaign. I don't know that a campaign would go for very long because there's only so many levels that you can push something up to.
That's interesting, like the idea that you can't keep progressing beyond the 2d10 level. So if you are 2d8 to start with, where do you go to other than just stacking on a whole bunch of +1s and +2s? It's an interesting question. One of the things I like about these games is the rules for customizing your warbands. So there's a leader and a warband trait system as well. So that is like a non-point based way of making these units more interesting as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because you'll not pay points for your leader trait and you'll not pay points for your warband trait, but they'll modify how you can build your forces overall.
Yeah, I do like the theming. It does help bring a kind of unified value so that you're not playing just a bunch of generic, like, we're a bunch of generic dudes with guns. It's like, no, these are like Terminator robots. They have these traits. You could technically apply them to whoever you want, but it's nice having that idea of factions. And then that becomes more like special traits in Sword Weirdos, as we mentioned, it being a little bit more bespoke to the unit.
And they're balancing a wider range of characters and trope types in Sword Weirdos than Space Weirdos. I think Space Weirdos does a really good job of allowing you to use practically any model that you have on the shelf. Mm-hmm. But Sword Weirdos will allow those models to behave in more interestingly unique ways from each other.
I like the terrain rules. Just to jump into that aspect. This is sort of a side discussion, but it might be interesting to explore. The level of importance that a game puts on terrain is very telling of what sort of game it is. I'm thinking of, like, you recently played the current edition of Warhammer 40K, and terrain only really affects vehicles and line of sight, if I'm correct.
In a lot of ways, infantry have a lot of interesting relationships and exemptions from moving through different terrain types. So it's not as defining of your table in some respects. Like, you need your line of sight blockers to hide behind, but you're not occupying terrain in the same way as like a more nuanced World War II game where you're on the second story of this house. You know what I'm saying?
I do like that even Space Weirdos has a sort of strikes a kind of a middle ground where if I can see part of the model, like a significant part of the model, I can shoot it. And I think it's based on the base of the model as the defining point, which is not unheard of in other games.
It's using true line of sight as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it does lean more into that intuitive, what you see is what you get kind of ruling system, but it at least gives a recognition for terrain. I think that Sword Weirdos does a slightly better version of this by having obstacles that need to be traversed with some cost to your movement.
Right.
As opposed to, in a lot of cases in Space Weirdos, I'm like, oh, there's this barrier, but I have to walk around it.
Yeah, I have to take 2 actions to make a V shape to go around it. Yeah, for sure. You can do a little bit of different movement as Sword Weirdos. Again, making Sword Weirdos feel a bit like a 1.5 edition of this game.
The section on terrain and movement could easily be just brought over into the other game. As to the specific act of mixing the two to make an updated Space Weirdos, I have sort of entertained that idea, and it would technically work, but some elements of the game are a little too different from each other that you would effectively be just making a new game based on the same system. So, as it might seem like it would be easy enough to just transplant, there's some areas where they don't quite line up.
In terms of your requirements to actually get this game on table, you basically need a PDF, 2 sets of D&D dice, probably a pencil and paper to record some information, and, I don't know, a very small number of models. You can go 6 to 10 models per side, and you've got this game running.
Yeah, it is very much a skirmish game. I'm trying to imagine how it would be if you wanted to play at a much bigger scale.
I like the idea of making units still one, like, 2 die roll, but they just have more HP, which is what the additional bodies of a squad would make up if you wanted to turn this into, say, a unit level game.
Having those different map scales gives some approximation. So there's a 2 foot and a 3 foot, and you can extrapolate to if, like, you want to do a huge table. I haven't tried that. I don't know if it plays well, but the game is so fast, and I have seen people do similar things in some videos that I've seen where they've definitely added more complex scenarios. I remember seeing somebody do a zombie fight where they had basically a bunch of zombies as a solo scenario, and they were trying to make their way to an objective on the other side of a map.
Right. Cool.
It's funny. It works with the terrain type so that they have these like shipping container effectively or like buildings that you can't enter. And because there's no climbing rules like there would be in Sword Weirdos, it is really like navigating this maze and trying to survive different zombie encounters that pop up. So there's like a range of customization based on the simplicity of it. And that may speak more to the flexibility of the game overall. It's not that every rules light system is easily customized. That might seem like, how would I say, is a sort of intuitive interpretation. But for the most part, that's usually true. And in this case, also probably true. I haven't tried it too much, but I can see being able to create more interesting objectives, more interesting problems, or other sort of scenario. Like you could create a very customized scenario and it would probably work pretty well.
And in terms of who this game appeals to and is for, I mean, if you're a sci-fi skirmish gamer or you're a fantasy, historical, or even RPG miniature gamer, you can play this. You are not asked to invest in a specific line of models, as this is a miniature agnostic game, and you're not asked to invest in an overwhelming number of models, or even the same type of models, as you can assemble your warband across different characters and manufacturers. Mm-hmm. So in terms of who best is suited for this game, if you want to get into miniature gaming as a new hobbyist, it's pretty straightforward. It's not a hard game to learn, and you can use whatever components you can get your hands on. If you're a more experienced wargamer, you probably already have everything needed to get this rolling.
Oh yeah, for sure. So it does strike a good middle ground. I also think for the level of complexity, this is a good one for kids to kind of get in, probably 7-8-year-old who have no difficulty handling rules of this complexity. And it makes for a really great introduction to just that level of wargaming, which then becomes a gateway to all kinds of things.
Ain't that the truth?
Get them young. No.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I thought that this rule set and a lot of the implication and I guess the design objectives were really charming and fun. Like, I thought the game was fun. Good job, Casey. Well made.
Yeah, I think this game was a surprise hit on Wargame Vault because it managed to aesthetically have a cool look to the cover. It managed to take a neat dice mechanic that was pretty novel and wrap that into something that was playable, accessible, but still felt rich with detail and character like an old school, more clunky game would feel.
100%. Yeah. So I definitely recommend picking this one up. It certainly doesn't cost that much, and you'll probably get a lot of fun out of it if you already have the models. So why not?
And for our next week, we are going to be diving into more of a topical discussion. We are looking at revisiting a conversation we discussed as one of our earlier B-side episodes. We're going to look at scope and scale as it relates to your tabletop gaming. We'll be defining those terms as well as providing a wealth of examples across a range of different games.
And until then, happy gaming.
Have a great one.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.